All right, so looking at this idea of trust and trustworthiness, speaking of developing trust, we had some different pieces of trust, and the ones I have on the screen, I have some other ways of saying it. So the first one here is facts and knowledge, pieces of trust, facts and knowledge. And so the action that we need to take then is to seek facts and find reality. Sometimes the troubles between two people is simply that people don't know one another. They don't know the facts of the disagreement. Sometimes it's just there's two people that are suspicious one of another because they have not talked one to another. And this idea of the facts, what are knowledge? Do you know them? Do they know you? We need to seek out the truth and seek out facts. We went through this last week, so I don't want to re-preach it. Okay, so let's continue on. The second one is listening. Listening is very important to build trust, and the idea is that when we are listening, it helps us to know, and then secondly, it helps them to know that we are interested and we care, and so on. And I think we've all had experiences where we were trying to tell something to someone and we were convinced that they were not listening. And it does not build trust, does it? It isolates. Instead of bringing together, it divides. And so listening is a very important element in building trust. Thirdly, and we looked at this also last week, understanding. After you seek out the facts and the knowledge and you listen, then you need to come to a point of understanding. And sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. There are some people where, because of their culture or because of the just the house in which they are raised or the area of the country in which they are raised, they speak differently. They express things differently, and sometimes they hear things differently. And so you can say some of the same things, and yet there's not really an understanding that's happening. And so understanding is a vital element also. So with this, kind of the action steps would be to ask questions and also to rephrase what could confuse. Sometimes if you're really having a difficult conversation, you feel like you're not communicating, you can rephrase what. So in other words, what I'm hearing is, and speak it back to them, and if they agree with it, then you kind of have an idea that is what they meant. Or if they say, no, that's not what I'm saying, then you kind of got to rephrase. Unfortunately for some people, they never even get to that stage, right? Because they're not having the conversation in the first place. But this idea of building trust, communication is an important element. So now, tonight we want to look at point number 4, and that is awareness of understanding. And this is, again, very close to understanding, but it's simply this. If you're trying to establish something with someone, and you come to a point of understanding, you need to help them know that you understand. Because this is going to help them, and it's going to help build this trust that we're talking about. Sometimes, and this can happen to me sometimes as a pastor, where I can see what's going on, and I understand the situation, but people don't know that I understand, right? And that can be a problem. Sometimes it'll happen, too, it can happen in a friendship, where someone's trying to unburden their heart to you, and you are indeed listening, but you're not necessarily saying much back. I remember one time I was having a conversation with a friend, and he was upset about some things and was sharing some things, and all I was really saying was, and that really bothered him, and he's like, and he mocked me and hung up, right? I was not really communicating this idea that I did indeed feel your pain, and it was poor communication on my part. So. But what this does is it builds trust. When you can express to someone else that you do indeed feel their pain, or you do understand what they're saying, and you're making this conscious effort to associate, what it does is it builds a connection, it builds a bond, and it builds trust. Now, there's a couple of scriptures that could maybe have gone with the prior point or with this point. They're very similar in nature. But 1 Thessalonians 5:12. I'll just quote that for you here. But it says, "And we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you." That's 1 Thessalonians 5:12. So he's urging the brethren, he's urging the people in the Thessalonian church, you need to know those who are laboring among you. And so that admonition really is for the church people to know the church leadership, to know me. And, if that extends to knowing, my needs and my feelings, know my personality, etc. And certainly the opposite is also true, that the pastor is to know the sheep and to be intimately connected with them. What did Jesus say? I know my sheep and am known of mine, right? So it was a two-way street. Another verse, and this applies more to the marriage relationship, in 1 Peter 3, verse 7, Peter instructs the husbands, he says, dwell with them according to knowledge. And that meaning is that it is on the husband's obligation to know his wife, to know her needs, to know her feelings, to know her personality, to know her strengths and her weaknesses and so on. And if you want to break down the trust in your marriage, you can just ignore the needs of your partner. You can just ignore the weaknesses and the strengths that they have. Some spouses will treat their other spouse with great disrespect, like they can't do anything right, instead of realizing that there are indeed some things that they may struggle with, but they also have great potential. There's great strengths. There's positives that are a beautiful thing in their life. And this idea is to express the fact that you know back to them. And to know that you are known is a wonderful thing. And it builds trust. It brings closeness. And it builds something that God wants us to have in our relationships. So you need to inform yourself, and you need to then let the other person know that you indeed do understand. So that is awareness of understanding. Let's move on to number 5. This is goodwill or compassion. Goodwill or compassion. And the action step that goes with it is learn to truly love and show it. See, this element of trust is really important. If we're working down from the top here, and so we're talking with someone, and we're sharing a problem. Okay, let's say that we have a problem with a car. All right, you may have a problem with your car, and now there are some people, bless your hearts, but I'm not going to share my car problems with some people, right? I don't talk with Tim about them in depth, and I don't usually talk to Kaylee about my car problems in depth. And it's not because they don't care, but it's because that they don't necessarily have the knowledge to go along with that discussion, right? But on the other hand, there are some people where you could have a conversation about a car that's not working, and they know cars, but they don't care about you. Right? Especially if they're maybe a mechanic and they're not wanting to share information because they prefer to fix it themselves and get paid, right? So there's a big distinction there. And so this idea of love and trust, they go together. We don't trust people that don't love us. That's why I know we're all very relieved that the election is over. But in these political ads, they often will show the politician like with their wife or kissing a baby, right? And what they're trying to do is show that this politician has a heart. He has compassion, and he's a normal guy that has a love for the normal things just like I do. And they're trying to establish this element of trust to show that this person is a loving person. They're a normal, loving person. And one verse that reminds me of this element of love and trust is in Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 is about the good wife. And it goes on to list all of her distinctions and her work and her heart and her character. And notice what it says in verse 11. It says, the heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. His heart will safely trust in his wife, and he will have no need of spoil. What that means is that he can trust his wife to do the right thing, to make the right decision, because he knows that she is indeed out for his best interest, or their best interest. As opposed to some marriages, you hear stories of, the husband's trying to make money as fast as he possibly can because she's spending it out the other end as quick as she possibly can, right? Guess what? This verse does not apply. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. And we could make application in a lot of different angles. But trust and love go together. And if you don't know that someone loves you, you're not about to trust them. this was a difficult experience of mine, but I had a good friend that went through a period where he was separated from his wife. And he was a good friend of mine. And yet I never knew about any problem, any trouble, until they were already separated. And I had to ask myself, what was it about our relationship that he couldn't trust to say that? You know, it maybe was not simply that I was untrustworthy. Maybe there was other elements involved. But even so, when we know someone really loves us, it builds trust. We don't trust people that don't care about us. And so a big point here that we really need to emphasize is that sometimes people know that you are a good person or that you love them, but they're not. If you want to build deep trust, you have to show that you love them, that you love them more than you love yourself. Because our world is full of people that love themselves, right? And they'll smile, and they'll go to a bar, and they'll have a drink, and they'll say, oh, I'm such a great person, and you're such a nice person, and we should be friends. And they're friends just as long as they're getting something out of that person. Money, they're sleeping together, they're happy, makes them feel good, whatever. But once they're not getting something from them, then they're gone, over, right? But this idea of love that goes beyond where we love someone where it even causes us discomfort or pain, that creates deep trust. Deep trust. Where you are willing to sacrifice, where you're willing to do something even though it makes your life very uncomfortable. Maybe it makes your bank account go down. Or maybe it makes your extra miles on your car. Fill in the blank, whatever it might be. But the idea is, I value you more than I value me. Does this sound familiar? The Bible says, herein is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation. See, when I realized that God sent His Son, and in exchange He got a bunch of sorry sinners, He got the raw end of the deal, didn't He? His Son, I would rather have my Son than have us. Christ for us. But see, we see that in action of this idea of deep love, where God's heart was about us. And I'm not about to suggest that our salvation is certainly for God's glory, but we're seeing this principle of sacrifice. And so Ephesians chapter 5 kind of sets the bar in a strange way, and this might sound a little opposite, but Ephesians 5 says, he that loveth his wife loveth himself. No man ever yet hated his own flesh. But do you notice how if a husband simply loves himself, then he doesn't love his wife? Yet when he will love his wife, that redounds to his own benefit in the long run. But sometimes in the short term, that's not the case. So when we look at this element here of goodwill or compassion, this is an important piece of trust. If people don't know that we care, then they're not going to be interested in believing us, trusting us, etc. That's sometimes why I think it's a difficult thing, and I'm not saying it's impossible because God works through a lot of different ways, but it's a difficult thing sometimes to knock on a stranger's door and get them to talk about the deepest feelings of their soul about God in 5 minutes, right, to open up in that degree. Now some people are very open, right? And so there are some people that are very open, but there are others that are very closed, and they're not about to really chat with some stranger on their doorstep. And the idea of once they see that we truly do care about them, sometimes there is more of an openness. And again, all people, there's a difference in some as compared to others. Learn to truly love and to show it. All right, now here's our final point, and this is a key point. Once you get down through all those things, the final point is there has to be action, there has to be responsibility, there has to be follow through, okay? This is the idea that we maybe think of with trust, is this idea of faithfulness, consistency, or I like the word constancy, which consistency is quite the same thing, but regularity. People can trust because they've seen what you did on Monday, they've seen what you did on Tuesday, they saw what you did on Wednesday, and so now on Thursday, they believe you're going to be there. And let me just break this down really simple. When you get hired for a job, Your boss prints out the schedule and he expects you to show up, right? Now, a boss will begin to trust you more when you showed up day after day after day after day, on time, day after day, and soon he will trust you more than he did on the first day of the work. You know, some people, and I've actually heard of this, this actually happened with church once, where someone was always in church, and they didn't miss. And so one Sunday, they were all of a sudden gone, and they hadn't called anyone, they hadn't told anyone, no one knew where they were. And so they sent someone to investigate them, and I can't remember if they had a stroke, or if they had had some physical malady, or if there was a kidnapper or something. But the point was, they said going to church regularly saved their life. Because if they had been someone that was out, here and there, and never, that nobody would have looked after them, and they would have died in their home. That's an extreme example, but it's that idea that we're talking about of trust. And if we're people that are constantly going back on our word, and we say we'll do this, and then we do something else, and flitting from this to this to this, what it does is it harms trust. It harms trust. And so a verse that comes to my mind here with this is Psalm 15:4. And this is describing a good man. It says, "He that sweareth to his own hurt and changeth not." The idea is when he says he's going to do something, he does it. Even if it turns out to not be as good a deal. I remember talking to a contractor, and he had told me that he bid too low on a job. And what that meant is he said, yeah, I'll do this work and I'll do it for this amount of money. And yet he still did the work even though it took a whole lot longer, and even though he maybe didn't make any money on the deal. He did the work because he said that's what he would do it for. And that's an illustration of that. So when we talk about this taking action or building this element of taking responsibility, we need to know that trust is built over time. Trust is built over time. I had someone bemoaning how people don't open up and share their heart and share their thoughts. And I was explaining to them a little bit, I said, there's got to be a time element, We don't just share the deepest things of our heart with a stranger. As you get to know them, then you share deeper things. And that's why time and friendship, we talk about relationships. Time and relationships go together. That's why it's such a hard thing when you're like a military family, and every 2 years you're being uprooted. Why? Because it takes time to form those bonds, and then they all get cut off, and move somewhere else. And so this idea of faithfulness, constancy, follow-through is an important element in building trust. It is an earned thing. It's not a gift. Do you remember when we were going through an Acts class on Sunday, we talked about John Mark left the trip. Do you remember that? John Mark was on that first missionary journey. He left and he went home to Jerusalem. Now, when the second missionary journey came around, he wanted to go again, and Barnabas wanted to bring him again, and Paul said no. And it's very interesting, this element of trust here is that Paul didn't trust John Mark because of what had happened prior. And Barnabas did have some level of trust in John Mark, and it could have been because Barnabas knew him a lot longer than Paul did. And so you can see, even in that illustration there in the Acts class, how trust plays a role in relationships. Paul did not trust him, Barnabas did, and the contention was so great they separated, and Barnabas took him on a separate journey. And so as we look at these different points, all of these are important for building trust. Pieces of trust. Now, I want to turn now to 1 Samuel 18, all right? 1 Samuel 18. And as we go through this, I'm wanting to read several chapters, just kind of as a conclusion here. Some of y'all are getting real concerned. Read several chapters. Yes, read several chapters. And I just want to point out as we go through the story of these different examples. Now, some of them are negative examples, and some of them are positive examples of how trust impacts relationships. And in 1 Samuel 18, we're going to read about Jonathan and David as well as Saul. And for those of you that maybe don't know a lot about this story, let me just simply explain that at this time Saul was the first king of Israel. And Saul had a son who was named Jonathan. And he was his firstborn. And when a king has a firstborn son, the implication is that when the king dies, his son becomes king. Well, because of Saul's sin, God had already given the kingdom to David, someone who is not related to Saul, and David and the king's son, Jonathan, were best friends. And so there's a lot of interaction here with how Saul didn't like David, and he wanted Jonathan to be king, and there's a lot of animosity, and yet Jonathan and David were best friends. All right, so let's begin in verse 1, and let's read through this story here. And as we read, pay attention and look for these different elements that we've looked at tonight. All right, verse 1, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." Here we find this element of compassion or goodwill, number 5 there. David and Jonathan have a special relationship. There is true love there. They love one another. All right, verse 2. "And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house." All right, so what this is saying is that Saul is keeping David at the palace. He's not letting him go back home. It's not a bad thing, okay? It's a good thing. He had just killed Goliath. He wanted him around, etc. Verse 3, "Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul." So here they make this agreement. There's a covenant, and they're binding their hearts together in friendship. All right, verse 4, "And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword and his bow and to his girdle." All right, so this is the idea here is that there's the outer clothing, and then there's sort of like underclothing. And he would have had special royal robes, okay? And yet he gives this robe, as well as his sword, to David. And so when he does this is a very symbolic thing, but what it's doing is it's showing the depth of his love for David. Because he's willing to take something that was his, that gave him a position of dignity, and give it to David. And it shows that he's valuing David more than he's valuing himself. Make sense? All right, verse 5, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." All right, so when it says he was accepted, that gives us the idea of trust, and it's saying that the people accepted him. They received him. The opposite of being accepted is to be rejected, right? And when people accept, there's an element of trust. When people reject, there's certainly an element that they don't trust. And it says he was accepted in the sight of all the people. All right, verse 6, "And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, with instruments and music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. So here we find distrust happening between Saul and David. And the feeling is happening because Saul, his kingdom, he feels is threatened. And he does not love David more than himself. He loves him a whole lot less than himself. He's simply happy to have him there to serve his interests. And so because there's a threat, there's doubt, there's distrust, and there's alienation. Okay? Verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand, as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. There's a lot we could say in explanation, but God had taken his hand off of Saul. He had put his hand on David, and there's a lot of jealousy happening here because of that. All right. Verse 13. Therefore Saul removed him from him, and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. So even here we see this idea of distance. He does not trust him, so he puts a distance. He sends him out. He says, oh, just stick him there with the army men. Give him a Give him 1,000 men and let him be in a little, put him over there. Verse 14, and David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. So this fear, this wall, this distance is increasing, and the trust is not there at all. All right. Verse 17, and Saul said unto David, behold, my elder brother Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, who am I? And what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel the Meholathite to wife. All right, so here we have Saul plotting to entrap David. He says, yeah, I'll give you my wife. And he arranges this, and then he goes back on his word and he gives her to someone else. So right here we have this idea of the follow-through, the taking action based on what you've said that you would do is not happening. So Saul is breaking his trust with David again and again. And, we can see the breakdown and how it continues on. All right, verse 20. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of my twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly, and say, behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. So he tells his servants to lie, and he sends them forth to try to get this to happen. And it's interesting, but he's trying to get the facts in front of David. He's trying to create an understanding with David, even though it's based on deceit. He's reaching out to David, and so because of the suspicion and because of what's happened before, he tried to kill David, he's sending these servants back and forth, and he says, tell him this. Tell him that I really like him. Tell him that my servants like him, and that it'd be great if he was the king's son-in-law. And so he's sending these men forth to communicate, to establish these facts, to gain the trust of David. Verse 23, and Saul's servant spake those words in the ears of David. And David said, seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And so verse 24, and the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this manner spake David. What's happening now is the facts have been spoken. You should marry my daughter. And now Saul is listening to the response. And David says, how can I be a son-in-law to the king? Because, first of all, I'm a nobody, but secondly, I'm poor. And we don't understand this. Well, we could sort of understand this, right? You got to go buy a ring for that girl, right? And if it's like if her dad's really rich and he's a king, you probably don't want to get a cheap ring. You got to get an expensive ring, right? Well, it wasn't quite like that. They didn't do rings, but there was a lot of money that went if you were a privileged girl. That's called the dowry. And so David's saying, look, I'm poor. I don't have money, and so how's this going to work? Saul is listening to this, and now Saul understands. I forgot, David's poor. He just plays the harp and I throw javelins at him and he can't make any money, So I send him off to be a little captain in the army, and captain's pay is horrible. He doesn't have any money. So now he's got to communicate, and there's an awareness of this understanding. So he's wanting to make sure David understands, hey, that's okay. I don't care about that. So verse 24, and the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this manner spake David. And Saul said, thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, no money, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. There was no goodwill or compassion on the hand of Saul here. He's plotting this whole thing, so he's hoping he's going to go out and try to get these foreskins, and sooner or later, one of these Philistines is going to get him before he gets to 100, and then I'll be done with David. But I guess he forgot who David was. David was the one who had killed the bear and the lion and who had slain Goliath. and the hand of the Lord was with him. So as the story goes on, this, of course, doesn't work. Verse 26, and when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. So here he does follow through with actually giving his wife to David. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Talk about getting beaten at your own game. My daughter does love him. The hand of God is indeed with him. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of that, do you? But Saul was. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. See, Saul had undercut the relationship, had tried to undercut it again and again. And there couldn't be a relationship between Saul and David. And most of that really lay on Saul's end. It wasn't like David was a man of God. David did the right thing. And yet Saul did not build trust. He lied. He schemed. He did not have goodwill and true love. And you can't have a relationship in those circumstances. All right. Let's skip to chapter 19. All right. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. Again, we find Jonathan and David where Jonathan has the facts. David does not have the facts. And Jonathan is in this special situation. He's the king's son. He's friends with David. And he could have the kingdom. And he has a relationship, one that he should trust his father. He should respect his father. And he has a relationship with his friend that he also trusts. And yet at this point, he breaks the trust of his father. And he trusts his friend, David. And he says, look, this is what's going on. And he gives out the facts. Of course, David listens. David does understand. And David goes and he hides. All right. So verse 3, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that will I tell thee. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistine, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? Wow. Jonathan is speaking truth to his father, isn't he? He is laying out the truth to his father Saul. It's at this point that Saul could agree, and he could get right, and he could repent, and he could have a position to draw closer to his son, to turn away from his sin, to agree, and that action would bring Saul and Jonathan together. But we know from the story that that's not what happens. Verse 6. And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, as the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. Okay. Saul says, okay. You're right, I won't kill him. But again, is Saul trustworthy? No, he's not. He's laying out facts that aren't true. He's making promises that he will not follow through on. And the rage in his heart is not dealt with. So verse 7 says, and Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all these things. So we have this great reunion happening. Oh, he agrees he shouldn't be doing this, and everything's coming back together only to be ruined again, right? And so we have the... I'm wanting to skip down a little bit. But verse 10, it doesn't take long. Verse 10, Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin. Verse 11, Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So very quickly, Saul goes back on his word, is chasing after David, and he flees, and he's with Michal, his wife. It's at this point that Michal, again, chooses David over her father. She treasures the relationship with David more than she treasures the relationship with her father. And she now will break the trust of her father, and she will maintain the trust of David. And what she does, verse 12, so Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, and covered it with a cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Now hold on a minute. Do you see what's happening? Saul had lied, pretended, he had broken trust again and again, and now his own daughter is doing the same thing to him. He's sending the messengers, oh, he's sick, he can't come right now, and she's got this fake body, laid out. And now all of a sudden, she's laying out facts, and she's making sure they understand, and yet it's all not true. And so Saul's on the receiving end now, and of course David escapes. And so David flees, he escapes. Let's jump down to chapter 20, verse 1. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, what have I done? And what is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life? And he said unto him, God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. See, Jonathan knows, and I don't know why necessarily, but Saul trusted Jonathan. And I think the point is that because of how close Jonathan was to Saul, it wasn't like Saul could do anything without Jonathan knowing about it. Now, if Saul had deeply distrusted Jonathan, he would have put him out. Put him out of the palace. He would have banished him or something. But he kept him close, and because of that level of trust, it gave access for David to know all that goes on. Now, I kind of want to skip down because there's a lot here. I don't want to keep you all night. But what follows is the story where David hides by the rock and Jonathan shoots the arrows. Okay, and it's very interesting in all of that story how that Jonathan is communicating to David. He's communicating the facts of what is to make sure he understands. They have their conversation. They make sure they both understand we are friends. We will back one another up, this oath, this covenant we have, and there's a deep awareness of their understanding. And then because of the situation, they have to go their separate ways physically. And yet that level of trust was there. And what happens at the end of the story, or not the end of the story, but after this, is that you find Jonathan and David very far apart physically speaking. But they have their trust. And you have Jonathan and Saul very close together physically speaking. But they have no trust. And so this story, maybe you can read through some more on your own. It's a great illustration of a lot of these different principles and of how vital it is to have trust in your relationships. I hope that God will help us to build trust one with another and to be people of trustworthiness. Let's close our eyes and pray, and then we'll take any questions. Lord, we give thanks to you for your word. I pray that it will instruct us and direct us. Help us to see how important this is, and help us to take action. Lord, I don't believe the average person here tries to lie every day or goes about to deceive. But on the other hand, may we be forthright, and may we be able to communicate and show the love that we have, and may we be able to truly listen and understand, whereby we could draw close one to another and build trust as you would have us. We ask it in your Son's name. Amen.